guys, episode 3, breaking down the basics, max intended inventory. This is the long form version where we'll go through some good examples and talk a little more in depth about what are the keys to a good max intended inventory document so you can present that to your regulatory agency without any fear that you're missing any information. Section 1 of that is applicability. It all starts with applicability, okay? You've got to determine what covered chemicals do you have and what equipment does that entail. Once you determine what equipment does that entail, you'll then be able to add up how much of that material do you have on site. So the first piece of that is you want to look at the PSM or RMP lists. We'll show you an example of that, but a key thing to focus on with those lists is, do I have a chemical that's just on the list? Okay. If you do have a chemical that's on the list, determine if it's a pure chemical or an aqueous chemical that's listed. Those are going to have different things that you need to report and need to look at. Also, if it's not on the list, or let's say it's not on the toxic list, there's a flammable list, or if a chemical is flammable and meets certain criteria above 10,000 pounds, then it can be listed. Okay, so that's another thing that'll catch us sometimes. If we have flammable liquids or flammable gases, we take a look at those just based on their flammability, even if they're not listed. In some instances, you may have multiple chemicals that are flammable, and maybe you're below the threshold with one, but certain standards list that you aggregate those together. Okay, so it's important to take a look and look at those definitions. We'll break that down more in our example. Lastly, for that, not only do you want to look at interconnected systems. Interconnected systems are what we typically think of, where piping is connected to systems between two vessels. You also want to look at co-located equipment. So maybe you have ammonia that's above the threshold value in tank A, and you also have it in tank B. And those tanks are not connected, but they're close enough where they could impact each other. That's co-location, definition of co-location. And those are important for when we're listing our threshold amount. Okay, so the key feature there is we're going to dive deep into, is your chemical applicable, and then how do you list its applicability in your max intended inventory document. So here we have a good example of the PSM chemical list here that we were talking about in terms of determining applicability. So if it's on this list and you're above the threshold quantity, you know you're going to be applicable. Okay, so one thing to point out, we mentioned a little bit, ammonia solution here. You can see it's greater than 44% ammonia by weight. That's when we start getting into, if our solution is above that concentration, we start looking at, do we have 15,000 pounds threshold chemical? Also, there's the CAS number here, which helps you detail if the chemical that you have is the same number chemical that's being talked about here. A second example, as you can see on the screen here, is RMP. It's a similar table. It's actually almost the same. Threshold quantity, CAS number, chemical name. It's not the same, though, in the impact that some of these chemicals have different threshold quantities for RMP compared to what they have for PSM. Another thing to point out is some of those solution mixtures like ammonia that we just talked about, the concentration percentage is actually lower in RMP than it is in PSM. So in RMP, it's a 19%, whereas in PSM, remember we just talked about, was a 44%. Okay, so additionally with that, if it's not listed, there's some other caveats. One of those caveats is going to be flammability. So I can see now the wording that we have up. This wording is from EPA. It's going to be on your RMP guidelines for flammable mixtures. So it says, hey, if you have a solution where the flammable mixture and the flammable chemical in the mixture is above 1% and the entire mixture meets the NFPA 4 criteria, it's going to be one of those chemicals you want to look at. It's chemical of concern. Also, a lot of times the secondary listing is materials that will rapidly or completely vaporize at atmospheric pressure and normal ambient temperature that are readily dispersed in air that will burn readily. That's the definition of flammable. This usually includes flammable gases, flammable cryogenic materials, and then there's 2 points you want to look at on those flammable liquids. You want to say, does it have a flash point below 73 degrees F or a boiling point below 100 degrees F. Okay, and then that's a class 1A flammable liquid would be a good example of that. Also, materials that will spontaneously ignite when exposed to air. This can be from static, just from any source of ignition. It doesn't take much for these things to go off. So those are the items we want to talk about when we're thinking about applicability. And so once you've determined if something's applicable, we'll talk more about what the table can actually look like for you in the next section. So here's an example we were talking about of that table, which is really going to help you create a total of how much holdup do you have. Remember, it's a snapshot in time. In any mode that you're running, maybe you've got a full tank and you're just starting the reaction, or maybe towards the end of the reaction you start loading again. We're going to take a snapshot in time of the chemical. Here, this table, the way this is formatted, this details if the chemical is PSM RMP. It also details what tank, what's your holdup in the different vessels, and totals towards the end. This is just one way you can do it. It's pretty concise. Another thing to point out there is here we have ammonia in solution. We list what our percentage solution is expected to be, what we normally use. So here we have 25. That's above the RMP percent of 19%, but it's below the PSM percent of 44. So the important point is we list what our solution is going to be. And a key point there is we have to prove, if we say no, we get 18% in, we have to prove that we're going to only get 18% in, and everyone knows that, and that's communicated throughout the site. So as far as max intended inventory, these are just some good examples for you. The table is a tool to your advantage for reporting and for your personnel. As we talked about previously in the short form, the goal here is you want, if someone changes the system or changes the inventory anywhere or adds a tank, you want that to be easily changed on your reporting, your documentation that you're sending to RMP. So it makes sense to have all this in a good, easy to edit format for your personnel and for your reporting department. Hope you like the content. As always, you can check us out on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, or at our website.